This is Charlotte Hudson, and I direct the Lenfest Ocean program. For those of you who are not familiar with us, the program supports scientific research that will help answer questions about the challenges facing the marine environment, and we're committed to sharing the results of the supported work with policymakers and interested stakeholders. If you're interested, you certainly can learn more about us at the website, lenfestocean.org. So I'd like to thank Dr. Will Figura for joining us today to brief us on the results of his study comparing landings of U.S. fisheries recreational sectors. The papers will appear in the Bulletin of Marine Science. If you would like a copy, please feel free to email us at info@lenfestocean.org, and we'll be happy to send you one. So I thought today Will would spend about 10 minutes briefing us on the results of his study, and then we can open it for questions that you may have. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Will.
Thank you, Charlotte. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I thought as she said, Charlotte said, spend about 10 minutes just quickly running through the paper. I will spend a bit of time actually on the methodology, because that seems to be a question many people had about how exactly this data was assembled. And I think it's also a good issue to tackle, because many of the reasons this study was done was because of that. So I'll start off by saying what the motivation in the first place for pulling all this data together was, and sort of came up with about four different points, the first of which being just a very general, perhaps public, and then spilling over into political confusion about the impact specifically of the for-hire fisheries, given their professional nature. There's a sort of attitude that I've come across many times, both in the U.S. and also, I should say, in Australia, where I currently live and work in this area as well, that the for-hire fisheries, because of their professional nature, are likely more efficient and probably taking quite a lot of the fish. So that's sort of an interesting question to look at, given that we have data on that. Secondly, and perhaps paramount to this issue, and with our previous publication, is the misuse of the online recreational data set. As many of you know, many of you probably know, those data sets that are online aren't complete. And so we wanted to try to pull together the complete data set to see what the picture looks like when you do that, and to highlight the fact that they aren't complete. And then also there's large questions around the sort of the accuracy, precision of the recreational fishing survey data, especially from certain sectors like the private rental boat and the shore sector, because of the difficulties in surveying them. So we wanted to pull that data together to look at how much of the catch is allegedly coming from those sectors, so we have an idea of how big or small this potential problem could be. And that leads into the last point, which was to address questions about how best then to improve this data. If we think there are problems with the data, what do we do? And there are, of course, as we all know, with the Academy of Sciences review, there's certainly processes in place already to address many of these. So perhaps to a degree, some of these ideas that we put forward in the paper aren't novel. They're certainly already being taken up, and I think that this data serves to sort of only highlight those. So before we get into those results, the actual methodology, as I said, the online data sets are somewhat incomplete, and that is well documented whenever you query the data sets. You've given, I believe, I haven't done it in the last 6 months or so, but all the time before that, when you query, you pull up a big page full of caveat data that, when read carefully, will lead you to realize that there's a lot of missing data from those queries. But essentially, the data set we pulled together on recreational fishing landings or harvest in the U.S. came from 4 primary sources. The first and probably largest source is the MRFS, the Marine Recreational Fishing Statistical Survey. That was the bulk of the data. However, missing from that data is all data on the headboat or party boat sector in the southeast and the Gulf of Mexico. So we got a hold of that data directly from the program heads. Also missing is any data on recreational fishing from Texas. They run their own surveys, so we went to the Texas Parks and Wildlife and got all of the data on that. And lastly, on the West Coast, we got the MRFS data for the West Coast separately from the Pacific Fisheries Management Council, and we had to go separately to get data on charter fishing in Oregon and Washington is assessed independently of the MRFS by the Oregon and Washington ocean boat programs, respectively. So we went and got that data directly from them as well. And then, of course, we had to put all this data and make sure there was no inconsistencies with species. So, we went through all that exercise to match all that up. And then in order to convert all this to be able to compare just raw tonnage of catch, we converted it all to weights, and that was done following the MERFS methodology, which uses the intercept survey data on weights to make those conversions. Now, in many cases, or some cases I should say, you basically try to use weights from the same time and the same location as the survey data, the catch data. In many cases, or some cases, that's not available, so we use a sort of a hierarchical structure of binning and averaging, either from a larger area or as a last resort from fishing in a different mode. And I don't have the numbers in front of me on exactly what proportion of the catch that we had to do that for, but especially in terms of switching to a different mode, it was very small, only a percent or two of the times that we had to actually expand to that level. Another question that we had gotten with regard to the study was the regions. We actually put this study together with the intent of it being very spatially explicit data. So we actually divided up the coastline into 23 different regions, about 10 along the East Coast, another 5 through the Gulf of Mexico, and then the remainder up the West Coast. And within these regions, then, these were designed so there was a parsimonious overlap between the commercial and recreational data, so we could compare the two sort of within those regions. And obviously, for the point of this study, it's all recreational anyway. But for simplicity, then, we've gone ahead and grouped most of the data roughly by councils, although we have in the Northeast combined the New England Council and the Mid-Atlantic Council, just for ease of visualization of the data largely, and due to similar management practices in many of those councils and similar species. So at the end of the day, what we've reported in this paper is some catch and harvest statistics by these 4 major regions. One we call the Northeast, which is basically the New England and Mid-Atlantic Council, so that's Maine through Virginia. The South Atlantic, which is South Atlantic Council, North Carolina through the East Coast of Florida. The Gulf of Mexico, which is West Coast of Florida through Texas. And then the Pacific Council, which is, of course, California, Oregon, and Washington. Alaska data was excluded from this because the methodology deriving of the Alaska catch data is mainly, I think it's a mail-in survey, so it's not quite equivalent with the rest of the data, so we chose to go ahead and exclude that. So that's sort of the motivation and the methodology of the study. What the results tell us, and I won't actually belabor these too much, I'll summarize them briefly, and you can see them in the paper if you want more detail. But essentially what we saw was that the private rental boat sector was accounting for the majority of the catch across species in all the regions. So if you just sort of look at averages, arbitrarily taking the last 5 years of the data set that we had, 2000 to 2004, in the Northeast about 73%, in the South Atlantic about 60%, Gulf of Mexico about 64%, in the Pacific about 54%, and overall about 65% was of the harvest was taken in the private rental boat sector. Overall, about 13% was from the shore sector, and the remaining coming from the combined headboat, charter boat. In the regions where those two categories are separated, which would be the South Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico, the headboat takes sort of roughly 20% in both those regions versus about 2 or 3% from the charter boat sector. Another way to look at this is sort of try to ignore the actual abundance of individual stocks and to try not to let any stocks that perhaps are very small fisheries, very specific, perhaps sector-specific fisheries bias your results. So we also sort of did another analysis where we excluded any of those small fisheries. I think it was less than 10 metric tons a year. And then we just looked at, for each fishery, where was the majority of its, so for each stock, I should say, where was the majority of its catch taken, which sector? And then we just sort of sum those up and look at the proportion of the stocks that had their majority taken in each of those relative sectors. And if you do that, that's our figure 3 in the paper. Again, you see that similar to the previous results, the majority of those are in the private sector. varies slightly from region to region, but overall, once again, it's sort of 60-ish% of those stocks have the majority of their take coming from the private rental boat sector. We do go ahead and give in the paper a few species-specific examples, and we wanted to do this because we acknowledge that while it's useful, we think, to just have a look at overall trends to inform this greater question that people are throwing about. In this case, the question being, how much more efficient are charter boat, headboat type fishing? Are they really taking a lot of the fish because of that efficiency and that professionalism? And the answer here is that while we're not directly commenting on the efficiency, the CPUE that is, of their catch, certainly when you look at the aggregate sums of the numbers of fish taken, according to this data, it's a matter of numbers. There's just a lot more private rental boat sort of individuals out there fishing than there are charter headboat fishers, and as a result, you're winding up with a lot more catch, even if, and I'm not saying that they are more efficient, but even if they are. So, but we recognize that while that's a useful sort of overall thing to look at, certainly when it comes down to management of individual stocks and their histories, you do have to look at it on an individual stock level. So we've gone ahead and give a few examples of the different stocks, and our Table 3 tries to summarize the top harvested species in the recreational sector from different regions, as well as their overall rank in the nation. So things like striped bass is the most harvested, red drum second. What was the third? Was spotted sea trout, fourth bluefish. So anyway, you can sum these up and look at the take, the relative take in those different fisheries. And I won't belabor that too much for the sake of getting through this summary. But what I will say at this point then is, so those are the basic results. And going back to what I said at the beginning, one of the key issues here was how reliable is this data? What do these results tell us about how we should use that data? And I think essentially what the results of this data aggregation exercise were is that the sector that we perhaps know the least about, or that there's the most contention about the estimates for, seems to be the one that the data so far is suggesting that most of the take is coming from. So it is a big issue. Certainly, if the results had come back to say that the private renter boat sector was taking 5 to 10%, unless we thought that those estimates were off by an order of magnitude, which I don't believe we do, perhaps it wouldn't be such a big concern. But I think that the reality is the data suggests it is one of the primary sectors taking fish in the recreational sector overall. So I think that sort of underlines the need for everybody to then work towards better solutions to get better data. And as I said, I know as a result of the review of the fishery and of the MRFs that changes are underway. One of the key ones being the reason that many of the data are thought to be inaccurate or perhaps biased from this sector, from the private rental boat and shore, is simply due to the difficulty in getting a hold of these fishers to find out what they've caught, both on the telephone, because many of them come from outside the coastal states, which are part of the surveys, and also at intercept points for intercept surveys, because their use patterns are so diffuse, especially with the shore base. It's very difficult to actually get out there and look at what they're catching. So in many cases, the solution to this is more money, and that is happening. Another solution to this is better records of fishers, and that comes in the form of this recreational license database, where the point is not to charge everyone to fish. The point is just to know at least who's fishing, so that you can contact them and find out what they're catching. And I think the hard reality is that's the only way you're going to get better data. And this is the same thing that we're facing in Australia at the moment. We're coming up against the same problem, don't have any information on many of these fisheries where, like one of the most harvested species in the state I'm in, which is a cyanid mulloway, or jewfish as it used to be known, is one of the most threatened. And again, it looks like not necessarily due to historical patterns, but certainly current patterns are that the recreational fishery is taking the vast majority of these. But we have much more worse information here than we do in the States. To the point there's only one survey in the last 10 years that's been done, one survey ever of the whole recreational fishery. So it's a challenge, and the same thing's happening here. There's a need for some sort of recreational database, and also a need for more money. So I think I'd just sum up by saying that's really the message of this paper, more so than what the different catches in different regions. The point is, most of the catch, it seems to be coming from a sector that is in dire need of better assessment.